is the law's concept of the person, the law of psychology. It's the psychology that I used to describe why you raised your hands when I asked you to raise the non-dominant hand. It's quote-unquote folk psychology, a psychology that explains our behavior in terms of our desires, our beliefs, and our intentions, the usual mental state furniture that we take for granted as part of the causal explanations of our lives. So the law's assumption about human beings is we are conscious, we are intentional, and we are potentially rational creatures. Most important, our mental states play a role, a genuine causal role in explaining our behavior. It's not the whole story. Obviously, the situation, your genes, everything plays a role, but your mental states are causally crucial. And the interesting thing is, our intentions are at least potentially guidable by reason. So let's take a bit of automatic behavior. Which leg you put through your undershorts first in the morning? My guess is you haven't thought about that since you first learned to dress yourself, and you've been doing it the same every morning. Imagine if you had to deliberate about that every morning. You'd still be in your hotel room figuring out which leg to put through first, because you couldn't possibly come up with a good reason to put one leg as opposed to the other leg. Hooray for automaticity, that there's a lot of automaticity in our behavior. You couldn't think of anything more habitual. But suppose I now gave you a good reason to put the other leg through first, as in, Adrian, you put the usual leg through first in the morning, and I mean this, I'm going to kill you. He'll figure out a way to put the other leg through first. It's at least, even my daughter, I was able to manipulate out of saying, you know, and like. Now, why does this have to be the law's psychology? Here's why it has to be the law of psychology. Think about what the law is. And the law, by the way, in this respect, is similar to morality. It's similar to norms. It's similar to etiquette. It's a series of, and now I'm being very superficial, a series of rules that order how we live together. Human creatures need rules for living together. And law helps us do that. Well, what kinds of creatures are the types of creatures that can follow rules, that can use them in deciding what to do, how to live, what they have good reason to do? Only creatures like us who are intentional and potentially rational and the like. Think about the types of folks we hold less responsible or not responsible at all. Young children, people with severe mental disorder, people with dementias. What's the problem? They have trouble following the rules. So that's the kinds of creatures we are. We are rule followers. And this is why we don't see, for instance, chimp legislatures, no avian mismanners, and the like. Because they, although they are, in some ways, intentional creatures, certainly conscious creatures, they are not rule followers. Rules require a language, they require propositions, and we are rule followers. Now, how do we justify doing what criminal law does to people when it holds them responsible? I mean, why do we care about holding people responsible? Well, what turns on it? Are we going to blame and punish them? Those are terrible things to do to a human being, to intentionally inflict pain on another person. If anything requires justification, that does. And we say typically we have two basic rationales for doing it. The first is retribution, giving people what they deserve. By the way, this doesn't mean you have to be harsh. You could be a very soft retributionist. You should think, for instance, punishments should be mild. Doesn't mean, it is not revenge. It is a principle of justice, giving people what they deserve. It is not archaic. It's not an old, outmoded relic from the old days. It's a fundamental principle that we should do the right thing. And one of the right things we should do is giving people what they deserve. I can assure you, most of you do not want to live in a world in which we only treat each other as manipulable objects, as good and bad bacteria, for example. And the second reason that Adrian alluded to, of course, is incapacitation and deterrence, which is what helps keep us socially safe. But where responsibility really is the rubber that meets the road is about the issue of, do people really deserve it? Now, let me tell you what the criteria for criminal responsibility are, because if you're going to think about how neuroscience is related to responsibility, you have to understand what the law requires. So first, you have to have an act. You have to do something that's prohibited. You have to do it with a particular mental state. You have to be capable of rationality. I'll give you an example of all this. You have to be capable of self-control, and you're not acting under coercion. So let's take, I'm accused of murder, the intentional killing of a human being. I have to engage in killing conduct. I have to do it for the purpose of killing my victim. I have to be reasonably rational when I do it. My self-control capacities have to be reasonable. And no one is holding a gun to my head and saying, do it or I'll kill you. That's coercion. Now, if these common sense criteria are met, the person is responsible. That's it. Now, notice what those criteria all are. Act, mental state, capability of rationality, not acting with a gun at your head or something. These are all folk psychological, mental state, common sense psychological criteria. None of them has anything to do with free will. Nothing at all. Free will is not a criterion for criminal responsibility. It is not even foundational for it. All our legal responsibility practices are fully compatible with the truth of determinism and us lacking this godlike power to act uncaused by anything but ourselves. And that's what most people mean by free will, the ability to act uncaused by anything but yourself. Well, that's a godlike power. It's enough for me that I can do what I want, that I'm reasonably rational, that no one's holding a gun to my head, and the like. It's enough to me that when you raised your hands to help me out the demonstration, no one was coercing you. It was a rational thing to do under the circumstances, and you fully deserved my thank you. As I said, causes are not excuses. Even abnormal causes are not excuses. If, however, the abnormal or normal cause causes a genuine excusing condition like lack of rationality, then you have a genuine problem. So in the case of Dante, what was his last name? Dante Page or Kip Kinkle, there's a perfectly plausible story that all this neurological stuff we learned about them and the psychosocial stuff and everything else produced a diminution in rationality. Certainly it did in Kinkle's part, but notice it's not because the brain was abnormal that we would excuse in those cases. It was because it produced a rationality defect, or if you like, a self-control defect. And sometimes I would argue those come entirely the same flavor. So, what you always have to do is translate any of the neuroscience evidence you're hearing into these folk psychological responsibility criteria. Again, we don't blame brains, we blame Peter Piper. We don't blame brains, we blame people, and so we've got to make sure that we can translate into the folk psychology. Now, before I move to the major challenge, and that's where I will conclude, let me just say a word about using this neuroscience in individual cases. If the behavioral evidence about these behavioral criteria is clear, we don't need the neuroscience. If the behavioral evidence is unclear and the neuroscience is really sensitive and valid, then it could help push us in one direction or another. But there are some cautions. Most of these data are group data. Can we make inferences about individual subjects from group data? But there's an even more important point for criminal responsibility. When these people, for the most part, are finally scanned, it's not during the time of the crime. People in scanners are not killing other people. It's months, sometimes, or weeks, sometimes months later, and how can we be sure what the brain looks like in the scanner months later is what it looked like at the time of the crime? Now, that is in principle, I suppose, a fixable problem. It's maybe a technological problem.